This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome. I'm very happy that for the second year the Woolf Institute is now part of the seminar, which is a really School of Advanced Studies seminar. We are held by the Institute of English Studies, the Institute of Historical Research, and now the Woolf Institute. So we are very happy to host today the director of the Institute of Classical Studies, which is another SAS institute. He has not indicated it in the papers, but he has recently published a book on ancient libraries, and this is why we have invited him today to speak on this precise topic. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Raphael, thank you, and thank you, Giles, Keith, for inviting me. Thank you, Isabel. It's a great pleasure to be here in a sister institute. You very nearly got the set, haven't you? I mean, you will now need to find some pretext for inviting the director of the Institute of Philosophy to come and speak on the philosophy of libraries. But I'm very happy to sort of take you one step further towards that target. I'm also proud to be one of your Twitter followers. The title I've chosen today is Private Collections and Public Libraries in Ancient Book Culture. And it does indeed come out of the book that I was involved in editing a while ago. And I think the experience of this was an interesting one because we set out with a bunch of library questions. And the more we did, the more we found that I was asking, how far does library work as an ancient concept, as a way of guiding in? Now, probably everybody in this room has got a sort of implicit, tacit understanding of what a library is like. We imagine ourselves sitting among ordered collections of books, and these books are ordered physically, by shelf, by cabinets, by room maybe, ordered analytically by rational categories, and that order is brought out in call numbers. And around these physical structures we can imagine a cast of readers, librarians, and just out of sight founders, benefactors, funders, publishers, and so on. And these hives that we sit in are animated by the quiet buzz of a reading public, reading, taking notes, tapping happily on their iPads, accessioning, classifying, cataloguing, repairing, issuing, recalling, replacing borrowed books. And this activity is so familiar to us, we often forget that it's very little of it can be retrojected back more than a few hundred years. And my subject is 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire. When it comes to antiquity, the existence of almost everything I've described is in doubt. For rhetorical and political purposes, we sometimes claim a very long genealogy for the libraries in which we work. And anachronistically, we often imagine ancient readers to be very like ourselves. An old colleague and friend of mine in the University of St Andrews, in which I worked until January, was given a personal chair. And when you get a personal chair, you're allowed to choose the title. So you can become a chair of X-ray crystallography or xenobiology, whatever you like. And he chose the title, a Professor of Classical Philology. And one of the senior administrators said, classical philology, you really must tell me what that means one day. And with a perfectly straight face, he replied, it started with a man called Callimachus. And so from his point of view, there was an unbroken trend of classical philology, leading from Callimachus, the greatest of the Alexandrian librarians, working on classical texts, comparing them, getting the readings right, indexing them, finding out what useful aids to their understanding could be created, and what he did for a living. The trap, of course, is we sometimes forget how much has changed. And my first aim this afternoon is to present a state of the question on ancient libraries. And I'm going to draw very heavily on the collective volume that Raphael mentioned, and which my collaborators were Jason Koenig, Katharina Iconopoulou, and we edited it in 2013, drawing on research funded by the Leverhulme Trust, to which I, like so many other people, are profoundly grateful, for a much larger project which included volumes on encyclopedism and another on authority and expertise. The project was called Science and Empire in the Roman World. So that's what I'll begin by doing, but I also want to try and indicate how the traditional picture of ancient libraries had already begun to unravel before we started that, through the work of a series of exceptional scholars including Christian Jacob, Roger Bagnall, George Houston, Matthew Nichols, Keith Dix, and many of them inspired by or reacting to Luciano Canfora's stylish but extremely eccentric Biblioteca Scompassa, translated into English as The Vanished Library. That library, the library that was vanished, was of course the Great Library of Alexandria. And it's something of an irony that in the reaction to Canfora's work, the Library of Alexandria hasn't exactly vanished again, but great libraries, although have come to be less central to the picture. And perhaps the message you take away at the end of this, if you're convinced by me, is that the story of libraries is very incompletely encapsulated in the story of the great libraries. And in fact, our concentration on the great libraries and the concentration of our ancient sources has led to us misunderstanding some important things about how ancient libraries worked. In the second part, I want to turn to what's known about private libraries. I want to end by having a few words to say on the implications of all of this for the great wreck of classical scholarship at the end of antiquity. So, let me begin with a standard version. The earliest extant history of ancient libraries is contained in Book 6 of the Etymologies of Isadora Seville. And you have this as passage 1 on the handout. What I've given you on the handout is a large chunk of Isidore, some smaller chunks of Vitruvius and of Plutarch in translation, and at the back some recent bibliography, things that really sort of Canfor and after, of a few key works that are of importance in the field. Now, the Etymologies of Isidore were composed in the early 7th century in Visigothic Spain, and it's already looked back centuries. But I'm beginning from that because it gives one of the fullest consecutive accounts of ancient libraries. This has become more or less canonical. Book 6 is entitled On Books and on Ecclesiastical Officia, and the direction of thought is neatly summarised by the rubrics of each chapter. First one is on the Old and the New Testament, the second on the authors and words of the sacred books, the third one on libraries, the fourth on translators, the fifth on who it was who first brought books to Rome, the sixth on who set up libraries among us, the seventh on different kind of opuscula, and then chapter after chapter takes us through one genre after another. Concealed underneath these rubrics, however, there's a much more interesting story, I think, and this interesting story is an attempt to splice together, rather in the fashion of the Mappa Mundi, a series of different traditions, Jewish, Greek, Roman and Christian, about books and their accumulation. So in chapter 2, we're told that the Greek, Hebrew and Latin terms for the book of Psalms are, and they're then compared metrically to the odes of Horace and Pindar. Sappho gets a look in too. And when we come to chapter 3 of De Bibliothecis, a parallelism is established between the efforts of Esdras the scribe, Ezra as we more commonly know him, in Jerusalem, and Pisistratus in Athens, great culture heroes and library founders in the 6th century BC. Once we get to the Great Library of Alexandria, established by King Ptolemy, it's immediately connected to the story of the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Septuagint, and then it goes on to Origen and Jerome. The story that most of the traditions about the Septuagint, how Ptolemy gathers together 70 scholars who sit in complete isolation and translate the whole of the Bible into Greek, and each one of them ends up with exactly the same translation, which shows it must be true. It isn't normally connected to the Library of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria has produced a kind of hub through which Isidore can join these traditions together. So Ezra the scribe, Pisistratus, the creation of a Greek Old Testament, a Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Library of Alexandria, all flows together. And then he goes on in what might seem to be an afterthought in chapter 5, you have in front of you, an account of how libraries came to Rome as booty brought back by Republican generals who had conquered Hellenistic kings and taken their palace collections back to Rome. And then the beginnings of some account of deliberate collection development under Varro and Pollio. What follows, though, shows it wasn't an afterthought, because when it comes to who set up libraries apud nos refers, not as it does in early imperial literature, to Romans. You quite often get nostri versus Graeci as opposed categories in early Roman texts. In this case, nos means the Christians. Who was the first who set this up? And so it is Pamphilus, the martyr who's the counterpart to Pisistratus here, and it's Pamphilus who creates the origins of the great Library of Caesarea, on which Anthony Grafton and Megan Williams have written. Isadora's history of libraries then doesn't just meld together a classical tradition and a Hebrew come Christian one. The classical tradition provides the model for the kind of history of libraries that needs to be written of Christian libraries when all the pieces are assembled into a plausible order. Now, I've given you this story partly because it's a great text and it's a nice set of stories, but partly to illustrate a point that Christian Jacob has shown, that the stories we hear in ancient testimony about libraries are highly formulaic, and they focus on the particular themes that recur again and again. They spend a great deal of time, for example, tracing particular collections of books as they pass from the hand of one famous owner to another. Jacob characterises this as a theme as translatio librorum, the movement of books, the handing on of books. Pisistratus and Ptolemy are prominent in several accounts. So are the various Republican generals who snatched the libraries of Hellenistic kings, Aemilius, Paulus, Lucullus, and others. A very rich theme of stories revolves around the fate of the Library of Aristotle. Our longest account of this is written by the Augustan geographer, or Augustan Tiberian geographer, Strabo. And in his account, Aristotle bequeaths his library to Theophrastus, his successor, that Theophrastus then leaves it in turn, along with his own books. You see the books are rolling downhill like a snowball, getting bigger and bigger. So Aristotle's core plus Theophrastus's accumulations go on to Nellius, but Nellius takes them all back to his own city of Skepsis. The books are then hidden, because at the time, the Hellenistic king of Pergamon, the Attalid king, is busily collecting as many books as he can to create a rival library to the Library of Alexandria. So this is rather like a sort of an antique version of the space race. Each side trying to accumulate their biggest, most powerful library. But they hide the book. Nellius' heirs hide the books that came from Aristotle and Theophrastus, and they're then sold on to the bibliophile Epelikon. Epelikon takes them to Athens. In Athens, they're captured by the Roman general Sulla. Sulla takes them back to Rome, where they're acquired by Tyrannion, who is one of Strabo's teachers. So you have a nice story all the way linking from Aristotle onto Strabo, who tells the story. So far, so good. Apart from the fact we're dealing with books, this might be a story to compare with the plot of the Nibelungenlied, mightn't it? The movement of a great treasure from person to person, entailing the rise or fall of the individuals involved. There are, however, many variants. Plutarch has Tyrannion sell the books back to the Greek world, to Rhodes. And Athenaeus follows Strabo's story as far as Nellius' Skepsis. I hope you're keeping track, because I'm going to test you at the end. But in his version, the books aren't hidden. They are sold to Epelikon, and they're not sold to Epelikon. Instead, they're sold directly to Ptolemy. So these ones do go to Alexandria to swell the coffers there, along with other books, of course, which Ptolemy has taken for Athens and Rhodes. So another story of accumulation and transfer of books. Strabo also claims Aristotle's collection and the way he ordered the books provided the model for the Library of Alexandria. It's very unclear exactly how this was supposed to work. Is it that Aristotle had some system of class marks, like Library of Congress, that then gets reproduced, or does somebody follow Aristotle's notes and then blow that up? Or is it just another way, most likely, to build up the prestige of the collections in Alexandria? Another narrative cycle, which we have from Gellius, describes how Pisistratus, tyrant of Athens, created the first great collection of books, quite a feat in the early 6th century, as you will see. But they're stolen by the Persians, they're stolen by Xerxes and taken back when Xerxes sacks Athens and taken back to Persia. But fortunately, after Alexander destroys the Persian Empire and it's then divided among his generals, one of those generals, Seleucus, returns that library back to Athens. Similar stories are told about great statues going to Athens, taken by the Persians and then returned by Alexander or his successors. There's also a whole other set of stories about the rivalry of Pergamum and Alexandria. Pliny, Pliny's natural history, claims that parchment was invented in Pergamon to be a rival to the papyrus of Egypt. there's an etymological collection, of course. I used to live in a street in Erfurt called Pergamenterstraße, Parchment Street, which was the street of the parchment makers. So this is Pliny's idea of rival libraries with rival technologies. A competition between the two is narrated by Vitruvius as well in passage 2, which you've got on the handout. The most famous narrative theme concerns the destruction of libraries by fire. The Library of Alexandria is burnt down repeatedly. It is completely devastated in Caesar's war, in which, according to Gellius, 700,000 books perish. This is Caesar's Alexandrian War. It's devastated again in AD 273 under Aurelian, and again by the Arabs when they capture the city. And although Canfor has very carefully dissected all the testimonia and shown the sources don't quite say that, they say books were lost rather than the library, not necessarily the books in the library, and there's confusion between the library of the Serapeum and the library of the city. And other demonstrations, for example, most recently by Mirtu Hatsimir-Kali, that Alexandria remains a major centre of scholarship where many people, including Strabo, studied. So clearly Alexandria wasn't, in the aftermath of the Caesarean War, bereft of books. These stories, the story of great conflagrations, a catastrophic story of libraries, dominates our accounts. Now, most histories of libraries have been written very much following this pattern to date. And I'm thinking now about modern textbooks, which I forbear to mention. Reading them, you might be forgiven for thinking that the only libraries in the ancient world that really mattered were in Athens and Alexandria, Rhodes, Pergamon and Rome, and perhaps the capitals of a few Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon and Pontus, for example. These collections have been imagined to be vast and also critical. Vast in a sense of hundreds of thousands of rolls, papyrus rolls. Critical in the sense that one conflagration can interrupt the transmission of text from generation to generation. The scale of these libraries is quite difficult to assess, but Roger Bagnall hasn't been put off. In an article that I put on the back sheet of the handout, he's used a series of calculations to try and work out how many books existed at the beginning of the period when the library was founded, how much space they would have occupied, and used a set of converging calculations to show that the ideas of hundreds of thousands of scrolls ever being accumulated must be a fantasy. On the basis of papyrological fragments, numbers of authors known, numbers of works attested, Bagnall suggests the entirety of Greek literature in Ptolemy's day, if the library had a copy of everything and only one copy of everything, could have been contained on between 10 and 15,000 rolls. This is considerably less than all the testimonia say. Bagnall also points out the physical difficulty of accommodating hundreds of thousands of rolls. They're quite bulky. We do have some examples of cases, blocks in which rolls were stored. We have roughly an idea of how much space they took up. 700,000 rolls is the kind of thing that would give Senate House Library nightmares. Bagnall also points out the difficulty of the calculations he does, but he's pretty clear, and I think convincingly, that his calculations are right within an order of magnitude. Probably the library did include some duplicates, because even the smaller libraries we know had duplicates. This doesn't really affect the large calculation. Of course, if there were books of Greek literature that were not in the library, and that's perfectly possible, it's perfectly possible that they were selective in what they accessioned, then this collection might have been even smaller. Now, in retrospect, it's quite easy, I think, to see why we got it so wrong. Classicists, in general, are nothing if not positivists. Where there's no evidence, we tend to shut up. As a result, we tend to reproduce the biases in our testimony. And the bias in question here is a bias towards the biggest, the most famous, and towards any collection of books that can be connected to a world-class historical figure, whether it's a general like Sulla or a philosopher like Aristotle. From the early empire on, in fact, we know of many smaller municipal libraries, but we know of them almost entirely from epigraphic material. Even those buildings that are known archaeologically to be libraries are only known to be libraries on the basis of epigraphic identification, because no standard architectural form of the library was ever created. the repertoire of civic monuments. So we know there are lots of libraries. We know that they're not distinctive architecturally, but we know they're there from epigraphy. And yet if you look for them in classical texts, you find only one, and that's the letter of Pliny the Younger saying he had dedicated a library or bequeathed a library to his hometown of Comum in North Italy. It's this relative underrepresentation in literary testimony that explains why the smaller libraries have attracted so little attention. Now, this isn't unusual. The same applies to art galleries, to pinacothecae. The comparison isn't accidental. Many of the processes, as I've made clear, associated with royal and later imperial book collection apply equally to artworks. Cicero's letters, for example, show the energy he devoted to sourcing original Greek statues and the right kind of Greek statues to adorn the gardens in his villa at Tusculum, the gardens he named the Academy and the Lyceum after the two philosophical gurus of his time. The care with which Cicero specified his content, his worries over the quality, provenance, whether they're genuine or not, these are all the same kind of cares people lavished over book collecting. In this case, archaeology has produced rich complementary documentation. We know quite a lot about the accumulation of statues and of bronzes and of other artworks in Rome. The only category we don't know about much archaeologically are paintings, and that's because they haven't survived. We know a large proportion of surviving classical bronzes were brought by sea. Some, of course, came as plunder. Often came as plunder, and there's a nice story in Polybius about how when the city of Corinth was being sacked in 146, the soldiers were manhandling all the painted tablets to take them back, and a general reputedly said that if you damage those old masters, I'll make you replace them with new ones. Which is a sort of Greek story about how boorish the Romans are. They know it's valuable, but they don't know why. And so a lot of statues came that way to Rome, and we know particular examples, but they also came in trade. And quite a large number of the bronzes that have survived have been recovered from the bottom of the sea, and that's because bronze is easy to melt down and recycle. But if it drops to the bottom of the Adriatic, not so easy. Bronzes and marbles alike in Rome were the wonderful example of the Antikythera wreck, from which that amazing astronomical calculating mechanism is found, but also carried with it a whole series of statues on their way from the Aegean, presumably towards either a market or already a Roman buyer in Italy. Bronzes and marbles end up in the same sort of places that books do, that is to say, in temples, displayed, or in the grand houses of the aristocracy. So did paintings. The central issue, in other words, what we're looking at is thesaurization, the creation of treasure, the acquisition and possession of rare and expensive objects. And we might as well go the whole hog and call these objects, statues, paintings and books, prestige goods, because they're used in exactly the same way as prestige goods are used in ethnographically attested societies. They're the rich use power to create them or to obtain them. They then control them, they control their circulation, they display them. Their possession brings status to those who own them. Sharing them, would you like to copy my manuscript, is another way in which you build relationships through exchange of reciprocity within the aristocracy. You can see all this happening in Cicero's letters just as clearly as you can in the ethnography of groups that do the same sort of things with feathers or shells or carved wooden statues. Books are displayed, circulated, read out to groups of intimates, reproduced for friends, and finally, towards the very end of the Republic, made public. And Matthew Nichols has shown that the bibliothecae publicae, which we begin to hear of only at the very end of the Republic, beginning of the Roman Empire, were not civic amenities that the term public library evokes today. Instead, what we're seeing is a gesture of extravagant popularism. So bibliothecae and pinacothecae in Vitruvius, and you'll come to these passages later, refer first of all to specialised rooms in aristocratic mansions. The room where I keep the books. Apotheca is a store, of course. Bibliotheca is a bookstore. Pinacotheca is a picture store. So to begin with, it's rooms in a house. And later, these rooms are, as it were, opened up to the public in the same way that aristocrats opened up their gardens or brought the luxury of extravagant baths into the city, and the emperors themselves go even further, imperial gardens, the imperial thermae, and so on. So the same sort of gesture, a popularisation of aristocratic culture is being made by creating these great public libraries. So when we read Bibliothecae Publicae, Matthew Nichols says we shouldn't be thinking about school children visiting the libraries of the Caesars to look up material for their projects. That's not what an ancient public library was like at all. Caesar may have been the first to conceive of the publicisation of book collections, giving the Roman citizenry a share of what had previously been something for aristocrats alone. Augustus and the other emperors followed suit. In the process, the first great physical structures to house libraries were created. It seems that even the great Library of Alexandria didn't feature as a separate building in ancient accounts of the city. Peter Fraser noticed, who in his enormous book on Ptolemaic Alexandria, noticed long ago that ancient testimony, which tells us quite a lot about the shape and structure of the centre of Alexandria, talks about the museum and it talks about books, but it doesn't talk about a place for the books. In other words, the Library of Alexandria is a collection of books in Alexandria, probably housed in the Temple to the Muses or in adjacent stores. Nichols showed pretty clearly that even in the early Roman period, dedicated buildings were not created to house the emperor's collections. Rooms were allocated in temples, presumably in palaces too. The great libraries we read of in Galen's correspondence are a very late phase in this. Dedicated libraries like those of Trajan in Rome, Hadrian in Athens, and Celsus in Ephesus appear in quite a long way into the development, and they don't share a common type. Hadrian's library, at least, seems to have accommodated other activities, teaching rooms, porticos, gardens, rather as did the Temple of Peace in Rome or Pompey's theatre. We need, if we can, to unthink the idea of a library as a unitary and independent institution, and ask instead how books, their curation, their display, and their reading were incorporated into more capacious cultural projects. Similarly, although we know the names of many Greek scholars who were pensioned as imperial librarians, just as in Alexandria, there's not very much sign that their job description very closely resembled people who are called librarians today. We don't really imagine Callimachus worrying about employment of his subordinates or collection development or things like that. Instead, we're seeing scholars who are brought in around collections of books, just as, in fact, when Pompey and Lucullus and the rest brought their collections of books back to Rome, they brought with them scholars to look after them. And Elizabeth Rawson's wonderful book on intellectual life in Rome gives a clear sense of how acquiring culture meant not just acquiring things, but acquiring people who knew how to do the right things with things as well. We've had some fascinating recent glimpses of the scale and quality of these late imperial holdings, particularly in the recently published text of Galen's treatise on grief. It's clear that some privileged individuals were able to consult manuscripts in the imperial collections and perhaps copy them. There's absolutely no sense that they're borrowing or doing any of the other things that we do. The same text also makes clear access to the emperor's libraries was no substitute for a private collection. The grief that gives Galen's book its title is to do with the destruction of his own book collections. Ancient libraries, then, to conclude the first part of this talk, look a little different to modern ones. It follows it doesn't make much sense to approach them, as it were, from library side with a checklist of questions such as when were they open? Who could be readers? What were borrowing rights like? Was there a catalogue? Were books arranged by subject? How were collections developed? And so on. All those are sensible questions for talking about the libraries of the last few hundred years, but maybe not so sensible for the ancient world, where bibliotheca very often just meant a storeroom or all the books I own. It makes more sense then to situate ancient libraries as part of a generalised history of collecting and thesaurization. Libraries were treasure houses rather than research centres. Let me now turn to the privately owned book collections. Book collection is, in fact, I think, a better term than library for much of what we're dealing with in the late classical Hellenistic and especially the Roman period. Presumably almost any society that begins to produce text in any number needs after a while to find ways of storing them and occasionally to retrieve ones that they want from the stores. Eleanor Robson in UCL, Professor of Ancient Near Eastern History, in the collection we edited, drew a useful distinction between archives in which ephemeral material is stored essentially to allow data recovery at a later point, and libraries in which the works are amassed because they're believed to have some lasting literary or religious or other importance, a kind of quality threshold rather than data. Nobody plunges into a library in the ancient world to get a few facts out. That's what an archive is for. The line's obviously not hard and fast. Even at Rome we know that some temples house not only papyrus rolls containing literary works but also wills, treaties and laws. But the great mass of written material that generated in the Roman period, contracts, bills of sale, tax documents, legal guarantees, like testimonia and so on, all of that was not subjected to the kind of processes of thesaurization and curation I've been describing. Often there was a physical difference too. Ephemera tended to be written on wooden writing tablets or on wax stylus tablets, on ostraca and so on. Public documents on whitened boards or carved on stone or engraved in bronze. Books, almost all books by contrast, were written on papyrus, with a very, very small number produced on linen and parchment. When does it all start? Well, collections of books, as opposed to archives of documents, are attested from the 4th century BC. Probably they existed a little earlier. Greeks, after all, had been using writing in some form or other for not long after its invention by the Phoenicians. But the idea that in the 6th century the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus creates a library is completely implausible. Why? Well, for a start, there'd be hardly anything to put in it. Very little is written in prose, almost none of it probably finds its way into papyrus, until the 5th century BC. If you think about the verse that's floating around, well, the epics are pretty big, Homer, but then much of Greek lyric poetry occupies relatively little papyrus space. So you could have probably the whole of Greek literature. You don't need a library for it, you need a large basket or a couple of cupboards. And so the idea of Pisistratus as a great culture figure it's linked in with the idea that Pisistratus presided over the creation of the first stable text of Homer, and a general inclination to regard tyrants as culture heroes who engaged in vast projects of culture building. Larger problems. So, when do we begin to get collections of more than a few dozen papyrus rolls? Well, it looks like we can't find much evidence for them before the creation of the philosophical and medical schools in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The tradition about Aristotle and Theophrastus that I mentioned earlier doesn't distinguish between their personal collections and those of the school. And that's quite appropriate because there is probably almost no level of institutionalization at the time. The Aristotle school is Aristotle and his pupils. The books they use belong to Aristotle, they're used by his pupils. And that's about the limit of it, and many of them are written by himself. The Lyceum and the Academy, then, are not institutions in a modern sense. They do, however, engage in discussing written works. And so once you begin to get sort of textual communities, in Brian Stock's sense of groups who meet together to talk about text, who care about their authenticity and produce new text on the basis of those conversations. Stock used this to apply to 12th century monasteries, but you could easily take this back to a philosophical school or a medical school in the ancient world. Once that happens, you begin to get an accumulation of material. Not a vast amount, but still a good deal more than in the archaic period. Socrates too had an extensive collection of books. Some people think this forms a library for his school. To me, it seems almost a sort of a non-question. We don't know much about the organisation of medical schools on Kos and Cnidus, from which the Hippocratic corpus began to emerge in the late 5th, early 4th centuries. But it seems to be a roughly analogous process where people come to treat some works as particularly important and add to them, supplement them, write commentaries on them. Texts begat texts within these textual communities. And eventually these collections of texts come to be something a bit like a library. Oddly, the period we know least about private libraries is the Hellenistic period. It's almost as if the vast Library of Alexandria, not really vast of course, has blotted out, has been so bright that everything else is thrown into shadow. Had book collecting become popular among the urban elites of Greek cities in the 3rd and 2nd century BC? There are some individuals characterised as bookish. Some books certainly circulated widely, but did they yet have anything like the Roman book trade with proper bookshops and commercial copyists? It's very, very difficult to know. It's not really even clear why Hellenistic kings are creating libraries. What set them on this course? Several ideas have been canvassed. Andrew Erskine suggested library building is linked to a sort of self-conscious assertion of Greek culture in the Hellenistic world, a kind of big public paideia project where you're sort of asserting the value of Greek culture because you're surrounded by much older cultures. So is it a sort of cultural imperialism gesture? Is it just the kind of thing that kings did that are more visible in the Hellenistic? After all, there's testimony about kings of Macedon patronising literary production, or the tyrants of Sicily. Is this the kind of thing kings do? Maybe it's even the source of these later ideas about Pisistratus. It's even been occasionally suggested that the Hellenistic kings are inspired by a very, very long Near Eastern tradition of royal libraries. I was immediately attracted to this idea because it's the kind of idea that attracted me. But it does seem there's some big obstacles in making it direct in imagining that the libraries of Alexandria or Pergamum are in some sense inspired by things like the vast royal library of Assurbanipal at Nineveh. One problem is that there's so little material moves from one to another that for perfectly different reason I spent a bit of time trying to trace the Epic of Gilgamesh in Greek literature. And this epic, that's the foundation of educational cultural systems for millennia, hardly exists in the Greek. It's left almost no trace. One or two, a mention in Aeolian, that sort of thing. So the lack of a transfer of content makes me wonder a little bit. There's also two uncomfortable ruptures. One is the rupture between text written in Akkadian on cuneiform and alphabetic Aramaic of the Persian Empire. Secondly, and others in the room might know better, I can't see very much hard evidence that Achaemenid rulers did carry on the creation and curation of libraries in the way that the Assyrian ones did. Nevertheless, there were other traditions of book collecting in the Hellenistic world. Egyptian and Babylonian temples had collections of books very different from one another, but these were there in the Hellenistic and in the Roman period as well. Egyptian ones were particularly varied, medicine, magic, myth, all sorts of things mixed together, and a whole range of different languages. From the 6th century onwards, many Jewish communities are keeping collections of sacred texts. Over time, so this, whether or not you believe in Ezra the scribe, it's pretty clear that the Hebrew Bible becomes clothed as a canon around that time. And pretty soon, other groups, Samaritans, the Qumran community, and ones we know little of, are also beginning to collect their sacred books. Now, all this is much less neat than Isidore's account presents it. It's certainly you can't arrange these in a straight order. All you can say is lots of different groups had begun producing books in larger and larger numbers, and communities had arisen which in some sense curated, reproduced and looked after texts that they thought were important to them. And it is just possible that occasionally there are connections between them. This doesn't, of course, mean that any of these collections are ordered and used in the way that libraries are today. Now, evidence really improves in quality in the late Roman Republic, and particularly with the Roman conquest of the Hellenistic world. Significantly, the testimonia about acquiring books focuses entirely on philosophical and royal collections, not on private ones. Maybe Hellenistic Greek aristocrats didn't collect books. This isn't the standard account, though, does have a few problems. For example, all this. You can explain a great deal in terms of books that Aemilius Paulus brought back from Macedon after he destroyed the kingdom of Macedon and so on. But in the preceding century, the 3rd century BC, some Romans, or at least some other people in central Italy, clearly had access to a good deal of Greek texts that were quite literary in nature. The earliest Latin literature, produced in the middle of the 3rd century BC, consists of loose adaptations of new comedy, specific plays, not the genre. Livius Andronicus' Latin version of the Odyssey, now lost, is also one of the earliest productions. In other words, the very origins of Latin literature entail an understanding of a relatively large number of particular Greek texts. They haven't invented a literature having observed one in a language they can't read. It's a deliberate collective project to create one, and it's one that could only have been done if in the 3rd century BC quite a lot of Greek books had been available in central Italy. Several anecdotes from the 2nd century strongly suggest that the Romans were known or believed to be particularly interested in Greek philosophy. One of them is the famous Philosophers Embassy, when 3 philosophers are sent to go and try and sweet-talk the Senate. There's the story of the Greek philosopher who broke his leg falling into a sewer in Rome, and while it got better, gave lessons in philosophy to the Romans. More concretely, painted labels dipinti on the wall of a 2nd century house in Taormina in Sicily suggest that include the library. Once you begin to have Greek libraries in Sicily and the Bay of Naples, people imitating Greek texts in central Italy, the idea that books come suddenly to Rome along with a whole bunch of booty seems less and less plausible. We might even ask why it is that Romans suddenly begin to want to collect books, because they've acquired a taste already. There's a story that when Carthage was destroyed in 146, its libraries were dispersed to Rome's African allies. If true, this is fascinating. It implies you have a large non-royal library or a group of libraries in Africa in the 2nd century BC, and that these barbarian allies of Rome, Mauritanians, Numidians and so on, were sufficiently interested in ancient books, presumably mostly in Greek, to want to acquire these collections. And certainly some used them. King Juba of Mauritania wrote a huge output, presumably partly on the basis of books acquired by his ancestors from Carthage. Now, we don't know much about the structure of these collections until the last generation of the Republic. The first author who actually used the Greek word bibliotheca in a Latin text is Cicero. In his usage, it can sometimes mean a room, sometimes a place, a cupboard, or by extension a personal collection. Some rather grandiose reconstructions of the Library of Lucullus have been suggested, partly based on the account given by Plutarch in his Life of Lucullus, which you've got on the handout in English, and partly on a passage of Cicero's De Finibus, in which Lucullus's villa is the setting for a dialogue between Cicero and Cato. In an article to appear next year in Tapper, Stephanie Frampton points out how fragile the basis for this reconstruction all is. At some point, some storerooms for books were transformed into spaces available for book-related activity. It's far from clear that Cato is sitting in a well-equipped reading room with nice tables and stacks of books and attentive slave librarians around him. He might very well be squatting among a collection of books piled up in a cupboard. Some indication, what's not clear is how far the process of creating spaces devoted to reading and other book activities had progressed before the first great imperial libraries were created under Augustus. Now, some indications given by the treatment of bibliothecae in Vitruvius on architecture. I've given you here on the second page a series of passages from Book 6, in fact the 3 passages in which libraries are mentioned. And I put them here to make clear how he's using the idea of bibliotheca rather. On 2 occasions, the issue is not how you're going to adorn an area for reading, but how you should set it up in the house so that the books don't rot. Item in bibliothecis libri non putrescent in the first passage. In other words, he's thinking of it rather as we might think of a storeroom for rice or for linen or something. This is about how you conserve these very valuable and quite fragile materials. It's only in the third passage in which Vitruvius talks about the kind of things that the grand residence needs for someone who wants to embark on public careers. And these grand houses do have libraries of their own, but they also have porticos and peristyles and pinacothecae, art galleries, and they even have basilicas. So if you're saying the kind of house that has a library and it also has its own basilica, you're really talking about something right up the top. It's very clearly within the mansion tax bracket. the spectacular vision of a villa that included all this is, I think, the kind of thing, framed in an age of Augustus and Pompey and so on, is, I think, the inspiration for Plutarch's account of the Library of Lucullus, written in the end of the 1st century AD. And because it's late, I won't read it all out to you, but you've got it on the handout. But I particularly want to pick out that when he's admiring Lucullus as the great Philhellene, Plutarch, the Greek who appreciates Roman friends, talks about a way in which the house of Lucullus seems to incorporate in it cultural structures that otherwise you'd only have in a city, like a hostelry of the Muses, Museon, like a Prytaneum for the Greeks, so like a sort of public dining hall. So what he's saying is Lucullus has created a kind of Greek philosophy theme park. He was fond of all philosophy, well disposed, friendly towards every school, particularly of the academy, not the new academy, and so on and so forth. George Houston's recent investigation of actual private book collections brings us back to earth with a bump. And this is, I think, probably the newest item I've got on the reading list. Houston bases his account, and what he's done is for him a library is a collection of books, and he's simply attempted to reconstruct, as well as one can, the contents of collections of books that we know about from the Roman world. That means he's using lists of books in papyri. He's using specific collections of papyri from Oxyrhynchus, from particular houses, and he's also using the finds from the villa of the papyri at Herculaneum. I'm going to start with the last one of these, because that's the one that's most often being compared to Lucullus's collections. It's also the most famous. Now, the Villa of Papyri was one of the grandest seafront residences in the small Campanian town of Herculaneum that was buried by volcanic mud in AD 79 by Vesuvius. The building, as it survives, was probably constructed in the 3rd quarter of the last century BC. So we're really looking at something 50-25, so after the death, mostly after the death of Cicero or Caesar. Perhaps constructed near the end of Caesar's time in Gaul. It's difficult to be precise, and it may of course have been rebuilt on earlier structures, but this is the time of this building. It's a very extravagant building with statuary in it as well as papyri. During its excavation, which had to be done laterally through the mud, a very large number of carbonised papyri were recovered, hence the name, and more than half of them are philosophical treatises written by Philodemus of Gadara, who was already known to classicists as a literary critic and a philosopher, and generally a Greek literature who'd moved to Italy around 70 BC when many others did, and spent the next few decades hobnobbing with various Roman patrons and litterateurs. Now, Houston's very carefully looked through the composition of this collection. He's not the first person to do it, but he's done it with great care. And his estimate is that the collection from Herculaneum probably comprised between 600 and 1,000 papyrus rolls. This is actually quite a large collection by ancient standards, it seems. Almost all of them were in Greek, although there were maybe 80 rolls in Latin. Most of them were philosophical in content, a bit of Lucretius, lots and lots, about half of the stuff is written by Philodemus himself, a little bit of Epicurus, some other Epicurean philosophers. So, highly specialised collection, highly selective. Not, however, the sort of everything you want to know about Philodemus collection that it's sometimes presented as. Philodemus is known to us as a poet, not a single word of his poetry has been provided. Nor, if you compare, as Houston has, the works in the villa with the works mentioned by Philodemus in his extant works, do we get a very good match. In other words, when you occasionally read that this villa represents Philodemus' own collection and a working library, people have been adding perhapses to perhapses in a way very familiar in the discipline until they end up convincing themselves they know more than they really do. The collection of other Epicurean philosophy is also rather selective. It hasn't even got a complete set of Epicurus. Naturally, the argument from absence of fragile further excavation might reveal other texts. not all of the texts that were found survived the fairly brutal methods of curation and reading that applied to them at first. But part of Houston's concern is to point to weaknesses in the common view that Philodemus lived in the villa, that the books were his personal collection, that the villa belonged to his patron, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus. But there's some other implications of this sort of rather sort of tough analysis that Houston subject to, which are important for us. First, the collection is neither large nor comprehensive. Secondly, the manuscripts in it were copied by very many hands. So it seems quite unlikely that they're all being produced in the villa by one or two house slaves. Instead, the most likely conclusion is that many of them were acquired on the market. Thirdly, the collection contains no text copied out later than the first decade of the 1st century AD. In other words, for about 50 years it was a dead library. Nothing had been added to it until the volcano blew up. In other words, we're seeing the relic of a moment of intense thesaurization of collection. People amassed a collection, the oldest manuscripts, about 3rd century, early 2nd century BC, not many of them. Then a mass of 1st century material. Probably this collection is mostly made before the villa was built, or at least before the villa in which its founders built. Though, of course, easy to imagine. I mean, archaeology is of such a state. We could not exclude the possibility it all happened in the villa, then they moved out, villas rebuilt and things are moved in. But it looks like the collection is made somewhere in the early last century BC. It's bagged up, boxed up, and then nothing happens. No one adds to it, no one repairs it. Alongside this massive Philodemus material, a little bit of older material, nothing very modern. The most modern piece of composition is probably part of a poem on the Battle of Actium, so after 31 BC. Houston looks at these and estimates that the working life of a papyrus in this area was around 200 years. In other words, this collection, at least part of it, was already approaching its sell-by date. Now Houston goes on and investigates 8 papyrus book lists and 5 actual collections from Oxyrhynchus. And his conclusions are, to summarise a long argument, that the villa papyrus is not particularly exceptional, that collections vary in size between a few dozen and a couple of thousand rolls, but most people had tens or hundreds of books, certainly not 10,000, certainly not 100,000. Ancient private libraries were quite small. Also, they're very various. Some people love philosophy. Some people love drama. These collections we're not looking, in other words, at the kind of Reader's Digest model where most people of any culture have roughly the same books. Now, this kind of model does exist in other cultures, I'm sure you're aware. Records of the of books left in wills in colonial America repeatedly produced the same text, a small set of books that everybody felt they should have. You know, the Bible, Plutarch's Lives, things like that. But this doesn't seem to be the case in ancient libraries, that people were able somehow to collect the books that interested them. They didn't feel a particular obligation to always have, Homer, Virgil, the tragedians or whatever. So it's quite a various thing, and this has, I think, quite large implications for us. People could, if they wanted, follow quite recherche interest. One Egyptian collection particularly interested in Greek history, particularly interested in classical Greek history. Many books are commercially produced. Most were probably obtained through purchase. Of course, the very wealthy exchanged books and copies. But with the scale of the collections we're looking at, and the way in which people are able to pick and choose, it strongly suggests that people are actually going out and buying, or maybe at least commissioning copies of particular works they're interested in. The physical organisation of the collections varies. Some houses had fitted shelves, some used boxes, some freestanding cabinets. In many cases, of course, we don't know. As for organisation, cataloguing and staffing, Houston's suggestion is that for collections of this scale, accumulated slowly, kept in private houses, you didn't need a catalogue, you needed a slave who knew where stuff was. And I suspect he's right. The number of collections available for this analysis is naturally very small. With the exception of Herculaneum, our evidence is heavily skewed to Egypt, and to Egypt at particular periods. It would be very nice to know what kind of collections existed elsewhere in the West. or whether large Greek cities like Ephesus and Smyrna had similar book collections to small Egyptian centres like Oxyrhynchus. Oxyrhynchus isn't that small, actually. It'd be interesting to know what municipal libraries had, like those of Comum. Some people have suggested that Comum is stocked largely with school texts, because Pliny also created an educational foundation for the children of Comum. This, I think, is another sort of attempt to make 2 and 2 make 5. We don't really know whether there's a connection between the library and the educational foundation. Quite possibly both of them express the same general sense of the importance of literary culture. My guess is that Pliny's gift of a library to Comum included quite a lot of scrolls of Pliny in it, but that probably just betrays my prejudices. The existence of these small private collections, the proliferation of municipal libraries I mentioned earlier, has some implication for understanding the Roman book trade. Our testimonia concentrate on the accumulation of a very small number of large collections and their movement back and forth between metropolis in the last centuries BC. But most books didn't participate in those exchanges. If papyri are mostly unusable after a couple of hundred years, then the books in those great collections didn't form a sort of ancient equivalent to the seed bank in Svalbard we've been hearing about in the news. They aren't the key repository through which texts move from century to century. Fires happen, books rot. Bagnall, among other things, points out that Alexandria isn't the place you'd choose to keep a lot of papyri. It's too damp for a start. It's too warm and humid. He also challenges the idea that of writing any history of libraries based on periodic conflagrations and catastrophes. Instead, he prefers a kind of constant catastrophe of books rotting away, of mouldering on shelves, not being properly curated, of papyri that become illegible before anyone has the energy or interest to copy them out. A book that lasts 200 years sounds a long time, but thinking about the timescales that we're dealing with in antiquity, I realise how many books might simply die because they're not loved. Vitruvius's prescriptions on the handout also focus on the perishability of these very expensive prestige goods. These are kind of problems analogous to the problems in preserving very rich textiles, mothballs, airing rooms, all that sort of stuff. Renewing the collection depends on constant copying or buying new versions of texts. Now, Marshall and both the Plinies have been recently mined for information on the mechanics of the book trade in Rome, production, circulation of Imperial Rome, of a self-conscious interest in the materiality of the book. During the long 2nd century AD, when the urban apogee of the empire coincided with relative prosperity and some social mobility based on education, we should expect that commercial book production had the best possible circumstances to flourish, and that seems to have been happening in provincial centres as well as in the great metropolis. The economics of the book trade, in other words, changed between Republic and Empire in the same way other economics did. The economics of the slave trade changed from a period where you get most of your slaves as prisoners of war to a period where they become really quite expensive things that you have to buy and source or even produce yourself. And the same thing happened with books. Books and slaves have a similar economic trajectory from Republic to Empire. The survival and transmission of classical texts depends much more on how these mechanisms evolve slowly over secular time than on the chance of great fires sweeping through prestigious but not in fact enormous collections of the Ptolemies or the Caesars. Let me spend the last couple of minutes talking about what this means for late antiquity. Most recent surveys of ancient libraries, including the book we ended, tend either to end in the 3rd century AD with the testimony of Gellius, Fronto, Galen, Plutarch, Arrian and others, or else to gesture in the direction of the Arabs. Great patrons like Laurentius, the host of Athenæus' Deipnosophists, assembled private collections to build their reputation. William Johnson suggests that in the High Roman Empire, great book collections revolved around great men with a capital G and a capital M. In Italy and the provinces, the villas of the wealthy, the municipal libraries they donated are supplied through commercial scriptoria. In fact, they're quite a complex set of commercial productions where you could produce high quality texts and low quality texts, and it turned out of course that the texts are not necessarily equivalent to the cost of the material. So the most reliable texts are not necessarily the prettiest ones. This library culture, as I've described it, was not particularly vulnerable to catastrophes, but it was very vulnerable to changes in the infrastructure that supplied and repaired it. That infrastructure must have suffered from the non-synchronised collapse of urban economies and the shrinking of towns around the Mediterranean basin. What happened to the great libraries at the end of antiquity is rarely certain. We do know a new period of thesaurization begins in the 8th and 9th centuries by curious coincidence, organised by Carolingian kings, Byzantine emperors and Abbasid caliphs at about the same time. But what happens in that gap between the 3rd and 8th centuries, where you reach the urban low point, where the book trade, or at least the things we think make the book trade possible, are least viable? Now, how precarious this period was has been apparent for a long time. Leighton Reynolds demonstrated in Text and Transmission in 1983 how much of classical Latin literature had survived the transfer from papyrus roll to codex, and conversely how much was lost between the middle of the 6th century and the end of the 8th century AD. In this period, roughly 550 to 750, almost no non-Christian texts were recopied. Many were apparently allowed to decay or actively destroyed. Of the 264 manuscripts that we know to have been produced, or that Leighton knew to have been produced in that period, and this is of course an old survey, only 26 were secular. Everything else was Christian. Of those 26, they were mostly technical manuscripts. 8 were legal, 8 medical, 6 grammatical, 1 grammatical. The emphasis on technical and scientific to the exclusion of art, literature, poetry is oddly reminiscent of the later criteria applied by the translators who saved only a part of Greek literature in the Near East by translating it into Arabic. If you look at the fate of Virgil and Cicero in this period, you tell the same story. Codices last longer than papyrus rolls, thank goodness. If they'd still been using papyrus, 200 years would probably have finished Latin literature off completely, instead of just shredding it. The story in the East of the Empire is different, but it's not completely different. Photius and the compiler of the Suda had access to many more classical Greek texts than we do today. Imperial libraries did play a key role here, but once again we should assume private collections were important. The most recent contribution to the library culture of late antiquity, which I'm aware, is the proceedings of a conference organised by Cavallo and Carrier in 2010, published amazingly later that year in L'Antiquité Tardive. I love the conferences I run to be published the same year. Its tentative conclusions are that private collections and the reading practices that went with them survived in parts of the West through the 5th century. Some kind of literary life continued in major centres in the 6th century as well. As in earlier periods, though, the archaeology is very indeterminate. There are rooms that could have been study rooms with the eye of faith in late antique villas, but they could have been other things as well. Books were kept in places without necessarily creating specific library-type architectural structures. Combine this with Reynolds' findings, there's often a bit of a mismatch. We might think that Spain, where the social continuity of the Visigothic kingdom, or the work of Isidore suggests there's quite a lot going on quite late in Latin literature, actually contributes very few manuscripts to the early Middle Ages. But perhaps this isn't surprising given the low visibility of private and municipal libraries in the empire more generally. What conclusions emerged? The main finding is that book collections are always smaller than we've believed. The great libraries, though they mesmerise our ancient witnesses and many modern authors, were much less important in the transmission of texts than we tend to think. More positively, our attention is directed to very, very large numbers of much smaller collections, highly various in their nature, very selective, expressing the freedom to choose of people who could get the books they wanted quite easily. Some of them are private residents, some municipalities, and probably there's a below-the-radar translatio librorum as private collections go into public hands occasionally through gift testimony. That lively and dynamic book world, described in passing by Martial and Pliny and Juvenal, provides the key infrastructure for the transmission of classical literature. What happened to that literature in late antiquity and after depends on the fate of those private collections, not on further investigation into the rise and fall of great libraries like the vanished Library of Alexandria. Thank you for your attention.